He didn't choose the marriage. She didn't believe in fairy tales. The wedding was arranged, a contract signed beneath his father's watchful eye. No music, no guests, just a bride in white, and a groom bound by duty. They slept in separate rooms, spoke in quiet nods. But when the fire came, she didn't run. She fought beside him, and in the ashes something began to shift, not because they were told to care, but because they chose to stay. Sometimes the strongest kind of love is the one no one planned for. Before we begin, if stories from the Old West filled with quiet strength and unexpected love speak to your heart, consider subscribing. Your support helps us keep these frontier tales alive, and we're truly grateful to have you with us. Now, let's begin. The wind moved like a memory through the Colorado hills. Slow, dry, and unwilling to settle, it carried the scent of dust and dried sage, drifting over the rock-bladed ridges and cattle-thinned fields of the Ellison Range. Somewhere beyond those hills, thunder rumbled like a held breath, but here all was still, still and waiting. Wyatt Ellison stood alone beneath the wide mouth of sky, his hands resting on the wood rail of the north fence, his boots sunk deep in red dust. Wyatt wore the look of a man well used to silence but not at peace with it. 33 years had carved him into a figure of quiet obedience, strong in the way fences are strong, not by will, but because they're fastened tight. Behind him rose the house, not a home, never that, but a monument of hard corners and older rules. Built by his father, Harlan Ellison, it stood like a warning. Power does not bend, not for want, not for love. Wyatt had never been asked what he desired, only whether he understood, and he did. He always did. That morning the summons had come not with rage or thunder, but with the dry rustle of a letter slid across the dining table. "You'll marry her," Harlan had said, eyes fixed on the map spread beside the black coffee. Before first frost. No discussion, no name spoken with tenderness, just a deal, a boundary drawn, a consolidation dressed up as ceremony. Lydia Haverford, the woman in question, was barely more than a silhouette in Wyatt's mind. Her family once held land that bordered theirs, now reduced to a house, 2 horses, and the echo of a name no longer spoken with weight. She'd been raised by hardship, shaped by necessity, and from what he'd heard, answered to no one's expectations but her own. Wyatt didn't flinch. He nodded, as he always did. But deep inside, somewhere beneath the leather and the quiet, something shifted. Not resistance, not yet, but a question small and sharp like the first crack in winter ice. Lydia Haverford had no illusions left to lose. She'd buried them one by one, in the cold dirt behind her mother's garden, in the slow foreclosure of every locked door in town, in the silence that followed when her name was mentioned in rooms where it used to mean something. By 36, she'd grown fluent in absence. Her father had died when the cattle did, slow and hollow, eaten alive by drought and debt. Her brothers drifted west chasing silver, leaving behind a house too big for one woman and too broken to fix. Lydia stayed. She kept the roof patched, the accounts honest, the horses fed. Not because she loved the place, but because it was what she had. Every morning she lit the stove with hands stiff from old frostbite and boiled coffee she never sweetened. Every night she pulled a shawl tight around her shoulders and read scripture aloud. Not for belief, but for rhythm. A way to keep her voice company. So when the Ellison proposal arrived, not as courtship but as transaction, she did not laugh or cry or dream. She folded the letter, fed the hens, and thought long. Not about Wyatt. She'd seen him once years ago at a branding, a quiet man who kept to the edges. He hadn't looked at her. That was fine. She didn't need looking. What she thought about was winter and the cracked chimney, and the next 10 years if she stayed. What she saw was survival, a house with walls that held heat, a name that still opened gates. She didn't dress in white when the wagon came. She wore dark blue, tied her hair back, held her shoulders high. The road to the Ellison ranch cut through dying grass and frost-hardened earth, and she sat tall the whole way, though the wind pushed against her like a warning. She expected coldness, resentment, a life of closed doors and separate beds. What she did not expect was the man who met her at the altar, eyes steady, jaw clenched, a breath caught halfway to a word he did not say. And in that breath something passed between them. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition, like the hush before a storm that might just pass. The wedding took place in the parlor beneath the high beams of the Ellison house, where light fell through tall windows like judgment. No music played. No guests filled the benches. Only Harlan Ellison, seated in the corner like a sovereign surveying a treaty. The preacher read fast, like he feared the silence might swallow him. Lydia stood straight as a fence post, her dress plain, her hands calm. Wyatt spoke his vows with a voice that barely rose above the wood creak of the floor. When it was done, he offered his arm, and she took it, not as a bride swept into romance, but as a woman stepping into a colder kind of contract. They did not kiss. Harlan didn't applaud, and no one smiled. That night, Wyatt showed her the room she would sleep in, not beside him but across the hall. The bed was wide, the sheets stiff with starch. A single oil lamp cast long shadows on the wall, and in them Lydia saw all the women before her, not by name but by silence. Days passed like folded linens, crisp, identical, without scent or surprise. Lydia woke early, worked hard, spoke little. Wyatt rode out before dawn, came back by dusk and offered polite nods instead of conversation. The house was large, but it felt smaller than hers had, as though the space between them pressed in tighter each night. And yet, there were details. The way Wyatt set his boots quietly by the door, never tracking mud into the hall. The way he left an axe by the woodpile, freshly sharpened. The way he knocked once, soft, before entering any room she might be in. These weren't gestures of affection, not yet, but of regard, a kind of respect that didn't ask questions or make demands. Lydia took note. She always had. She learned the names of the ranch hands, walked the property lines, helped the cook gut pheasant. She didn't ask Wyatt's permission. She didn't need it. And though the house had been built for power, its walls began to notice her. Doors stayed open longer. Footsteps slowed near her room, and something in the silence changed shape. Not warmer, not louder, but less empty. The fire came in the second week of October when the air turned sharp, but the land stayed dry, too dry. It started beyond the ridge, where lightning had struck a hollowed cottonwood and lit the grass like tinder. At first it was just a red shimmer on the horizon, a whisper of smoke in the wind, but by dusk it was real, crawling fast down the western slope, spitting embers, dragging heat across the ranch like a curse. The alarm spread with hoofbeats and shouting, and men scattered with wet sacks, shovels, and panic. Wyatt found Lydia in the north field, sleeves rolled, hands blackened from hauling buckets to the troughs. She didn't ask what to do. She was already doing it. Together they joined the line. No time for words, just motion, shovel, pass, stomp, breathe. Ash clung to her lashes. Sweat carved lines down the dust on his face. When a gust threw sparks into the barn roof, Wyatt grabbed the ladder. Lydia was already at the top, tossing down tarps soaked in creek water. She didn't flinch when beams groaned, didn't freeze when flames licked the hay. Later, when the worst had passed and the wind finally turned, they stood side by side in the smoke, shoulders hunched, clothes scorched, eyes wide not with fear, but with what had just been revealed. Not just survival, but something sharper. Witness. She'd seen him fight, not with anger, but with grit. He'd seen her lead, not with force, but with calm. And in that strange quiet that follows adrenaline, Wyatt said the first full sentence since the wedding. "You kept the west side from catching. We'd have lost the corral." Lydia nodded, wiping her hands on her skirt. You held the line, she said. That was all. But in those 2 sentences, something opened. Not like a door. Not yet. More like a window cracked on a cold night. Just enough for air to move. That evening they didn't eat in silence. They shared bread, shared stories, simple ones, a runaway steer, a childhood scar, and as the lamplight flickered low, neither reached to end the moment. The fire had burned more than grass. It had cleared space. The fire left behind a landscape of soot and silence, blackened fence posts, patches of scorched pasture. The smell of smoke lingered in the rafters, clung to clothes no matter how long they hung in the wind. But in the house something lighter had taken root. Not joy, that would have been too sudden, too loud, but the absence of tension. The corners no longer pressed in so tightly. The floorboards no longer groaned like warnings. And each day, Wyatt and Lydia moved a little closer towards something they couldn't name. It began in small things. He brought her coffee in the morning. Black, bitter, just how she liked it. She mended his cuffs without asking, laying the shirt by his door with a sprig of sage tucked beneath the collar. He taught her how to ride the ridgeline trail, how to gauge weather by the smell of the sky. She taught him how to store root vegetables for winter, how to stretch stew with dried beans and patience. Words remained few, but silence changed its shape. No longer a wall, but a rhythm. She started reading aloud in the evenings. Not scripture now, but Emerson, or the almanac, or letters she never sent. He listened with his hands folded, boots by the hearth, gaze steady. Sometimes he'd offer a thought. Sometimes he'd just nod. And sometimes, when the wind howled against the windows, they'd sit without speaking at all, but closer than before. One night she found him outside the barn, staring at the sky. She stepped beside him, wrapped in her shawl. "Expecting snow?" she asked. He didn't look away, just waiting for it. She stood with him until the cold numbed her fingers. Neither moved, and in that stillness she realized, waiting, for once, didn't feel like wasting. These weren't the days she'd imagined when the letter came. They were quieter, stranger, better. Not because love had rushed in, but because sorrow had slowly stepped back. There was no music, no laughter yet, but there was warmth. And in a house built by force, warmth was its own kind of rebellion. Didn't take long for the wind to carry word. Ranch hands spoke softly but not silently. The cook told her sister in town, and the blacksmith's boy who'd come for a bucket of ashes said he saw Mrs. Ellison ride the fence line with Mr. Wyatt at her side. By the time frost dusted the church roof, whispers moved through pews like cold smoke. Not loud, not cruel, but cutting all the same. A woman with no fortune, a marriage of convenience, a man too proud to speak but not too proud to soften. In small towns, silence is never empty. It echoes. Harlan heard the echoes. He watched Lydia at supper, the way she asked about the herd, the way Wyatt answered. He noticed the lamplight in the parlor, flickering long past midnight. He saw the shirt with mended cuffs, the boots set neatly side by side, the books missing from the shelf. These were not signs of strategy. They were signs of trespass, emotional trespass. And for a man like Harlan Ellison, nothing was more dangerous than affection untethered from purpose. One evening he called Wyatt to the study. The room smelled of pipe smoke and old victories. "You were given a duty," he said, voice low but sharp. "Not a pet." Wyatt stood still, jaw tight. He didn't argue, but he didn't nod either. And that silence, once a sign of obedience, now held something else. Resistance. Lydia felt the shift too. Wyatt came home later, spoke less. His shoulders carried weight she could not name. One night she asked, "Is this still my home?" He looked at her then, really looked, eyes worn, voice rough. "It is if you still want it." She held his gaze. "I didn't come here to be tolerated, Wyatt, and I won't stay to be hidden." The words fell heavy between them, not cruel, just true. He didn't answer, not right away, but his hand found hers, calloused and careful. "You're not hidden," he said. "You're the only thing here that's real." And still they knew. What grew between them now would either stand against the storm or be swept under it. The house, once merely cold, now trembled with the weight of choice. The morning of the reckoning came gray and windless, the kind of day that feels like a held breath. The firewood had been stacked, the stock fed. Snow threatened but hadn't fallen. Wyatt saddled his horse in silence, not out of habit but out of purpose. Inside the house, Lydia stood by the window, her shawl drawn close. She said nothing, but her stillness was full of knowing. Wyatt rode out before first light and returned by noon, hat dusted white at the brim, jaw firm with decision. He found his father in the study again, flanked by ledgers, maps, and a fire that burned more for display than warmth. Harlan didn't look up. "If you've come to beg indulgence," he said, "you can keep your breath." Wyatt didn't flinch. "I've come to tell you I'm not carrying your name like a yoke anymore." That made Harlan lift his gaze. His face, once carved from certainty, cracked just slightly. "You forget what you owe." Wyatt stepped forward. "No, I remember too well. I've lived by it, every order, every silence, every woman treated like acreage." His voice didn't rise. It deepened. Calm, grounded, unshakable. "But Lydia is not a bargain. She's not a boundary line. She's the first thing that's made me want to stay." Harlan's hand twitched at the edge of the desk, fingers curling around the ledger. "Then go," he said. "Take her. See how long decency holds you when the snow comes and no one answers your calls." Wyatt nodded once. "I'd rather build something honest in the cold than rot in the warmth of this house." He turned, left the fire to burn without purpose. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, steady. A new silence filled the air, not tense, but clean. Back in the parlor, Lydia looked up as the door opened. Wyatt stepped in, hat in hand, coat dusted white. He didn't speak. He just crossed the room and took her hand. Not with urgency, not with apology, but with certainty. "If I leave this place behind," he said, "it's not for escape. It's for something worth arriving to." And in her eyes he found his answer. Not a promise, but a beginning. They left the house at dawn. No fanfare. No one to see them off but the wind. Lydia packed light, a canvas bag with her ledger, her books, a small tin box of seeds she'd saved. Wyatt led the wagon while she rode beside him, the road ahead white with fresh snow and faint sunlight filtering through bare cottonwoods. Behind them, the Ellison ranch shrank into stillness, a place that had never offered home, only history. Ahead, the land stretched wide and unknown. It was not a promise, it was a question, and both of them, at last, had the right to answer it. They rode past the ridgeline that once marked separation, Ellison on one side, Haverford on the other. Now it meant nothing, or perhaps it meant everything. At the summit, Wyatt reined in the horse. Beside him, Lydia dismounted and stepped to the edge. Wind tugged her coat. She looked out, not with fear but with clarity. The valley below was quiet, rimmed with frost, waiting to be claimed not with conquest, but with care. She turned to him. "We could build here," she said. He nodded. "Not just a house." "No," she said. "A life." He took her hand. No ceremony, no audience. Just fingers finding warmth in the cold. Below them the sun began to rise, slow and golden, cutting through the pale air like mercy. Around them the snow softened. Birds called out from the pines. And in that quiet moment they weren't remnants of two broken names or survivors of a contract. They were something new, not lovers in the way stories tell it, but companions in the harder truth. Love forged not in thunder but in dust and fire, in the silence that listens, in the strength that stays. They did not kiss. They didn't need to. They simply turned back toward the wagon and began their descent, step by step, side by side. And behind them the wind carried no judgment, only the hush of something ending and the breath of something beginning.